I stood alone against her entire army. The alien Empress couldn't believe what the sky above the human colony burned with a strange light, a harsh orange glow that reflected off the tall towers and metal streets. People screamed and ran in every direction as massive shapes descended from the clouds. These were not ordinary ships. They were enormous, sleek, and black, with shapes that seemed alive, twisting and writhing as they hovered silently before releasing swarms of alien warriors. The colony's defense systems fired automatically, bright beams cutting through the darkening sky, but they barely scratched the surface of the invaders' armor. Ethan crouched atop a ruined communications tower, his heart hammering. Below him, families scrambled for shelter, their eyes wide with fear. Children clung to parents as alarms blared across the city. Ethan's hands were steady on the rifle he carried, but his mind raced faster than the bullets that would soon fly. He had expected danger. He had faced risky missions before, but nothing in his training prepared him for this. The alien warships, unlike anything humans had ever seen, seemed alive. Their hulls pulsed with faint lights, almost like veins, and they moved with eerie precision. From them, creatures poured out, not walking but gliding with limbs too long and too many joints. Their armor was a dark, reflective metal, shimmering even in the fires below, and at their center, commanding everything, descended the alien Empress herself, Zyra. Ethan had heard stories of her. Not many humans had, but enough to know she was feared across several star systems. She had conquered worlds before, bending species to her will, and she rarely ever failed. She was said to be more intelligent than any strategist humans had ever known, more powerful than any single army could resist. And yet, here he was, watching her land near the main plaza, her army surrounding her like living weapons. He took a deep breath and scanned the battlefield. Every human defense point had been destroyed. The energy shields around the colony flickered and died. Turrets that once could have held back an entire alien battalion lay in smoking ruins. Only a few scattered fighters were left, and most had already been cut down. Ethan felt a chill, not from fear, but from the realization that no one else would be standing between Zyra and the colony. He was the last line. His mind moved quickly. There was no chance of a conventional fight. He didn't have the soldiers or the firepower, but humans had something the aliens didn't fully understand: improvisation, creativity, and the willingness to fight against impossible odds. He could use the environment, the ruined buildings, the narrow streets, even the debris around him. If he could just hold them off long enough, maybe more humans could survive, maybe they could fight back. The first wave of alien soldiers moved in. They were fast, gliding silently over the rubble, scanning the streets with glowing eyes. Ethan fired a few shots, precise and deliberate. His energy rifle hissed, beams of light streaking into the closest alien warrior. One fell, its armor sparking violently as it hit the ground. The others paused, their movements jerky as if confused by his accuracy. He smiled faintly. Small victories mattered. They gave him time. Time was the only weapon humans had left. Zyra stood at the edge of the plaza, her presence enormous. She was taller than any human, her form elegant yet terrifying. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the fires around her. She watched Ethan with interest, tilting her head as if examining a curious creature. She spoke in a language no human could understand, but the vibrations carried through the air. Even without knowing the words, humans nearby felt the weight of authority in her voice. "You are alone," she said, finally speaking in broken common, the universal human language adapted by the colonies. Her voice carried over the battlefield. "You will die." Ethan lowered his rifle slightly. He didn't speak much. Words were unnecessary, actions mattered more. But he thought briefly, "I have survived worse, and I am not afraid." He ducked behind a collapsed building as the first coordinated wave of soldiers approached. Using the rubble, he set traps with wires, small explosive charges he had salvaged from old storage units, and broken energy cells from the destroyed turrets. One by one, the alien soldiers fell into his improvised defenses. Sparks and explosions lit up the night, temporary victories in a battle that seemed hopeless. Zyra's eyes narrowed. She had seen thousands of species attempt resistance. None had ever lasted this long, and none had used strategy this effectively. She began to shift, her body moving with unnatural speed, and her voice carried a tone of disbelief as she commanded her troops to adapt. Ethan noticed it immediately. Even she could make mistakes if forced to react too quickly. He adjusted his traps and began to move through the streets, luring small groups of soldiers into the narrow alleys where their numbers became useless. He used every advantage the city offered, flipping switches on damaged systems to create hazards, collapsing scaffolding onto advancing squads, and even directing fires to block paths temporarily. Each success was small, but the alien soldiers fell faster than they could adapt. Despite the chaos, Ethan remained calm. Every move was calculated, every step considered. He had always been good at reading patterns, predicting what people or creatures would do next. Even against an alien army, he could find the logic in their attacks. If he could predict them, he could survive. The humans watching from hiding spots began to notice. A few small groups, emboldened by his defiance, began to emerge. They threw rocks, improvised weapons, and in one case, a makeshift flamethrower rigged from fuel tanks and scrap metal. Ethan didn't ask for their help, but their presence added to the chaos. The alien soldiers were no longer moving as a single unit. Distraction and unpredictability worked in Ethan's favor. But then, Zyra moved closer. She did not need to fight the soldiers herself. She was here to observe, to measure, and to intimidate. Her armor glinted in the firelight as she moved, almost effortlessly avoiding the traps Ethan had set for her army. Her presence was overwhelming, and Ethan could feel the weight of her attention like a physical force pressing down on him. She spoke again, this time more clearly and common, though each word sounded alien and deliberate. "Your weapons are weak. Your city is weak. You are weak." Ethan did not respond verbally. Instead, he fired his rifle at a group approaching from the east, taking out 3 soldiers in a precise sweep. The glow of the shots reflected in Zyra's eyes. He could see her surprise. She had expected surrender, not resistance. She had expected panic, not ingenuity. The battle raged on for hours. Ethan moved tirelessly, using the city like a chessboard, always thinking 2 steps ahead. He set traps, ambushes, and diversions. He used the ruins to hide, then struck at the right moment, vanishing before the aliens could retaliate effectively. Slowly, the alien forces began to respect, or perhaps fear, his cunning. By the end of the night, the colony was in ruins, but not a single human soldier had been lost in the skirmishes Ethan led. Zyra had seen enough to know that this was no ordinary human. His bravery and skill were exceptional. Her eyes followed him constantly, studying every movement, analyzing every tactic. Ethan finally paused atop a half-collapsed tower, surveying the destruction below. Smoke rose in thick clouds, fires burned in pockets, and the alien soldiers regrouped cautiously. He breathed heavily, but his mind was sharp. He realized that this was only the beginning. The alien army was vast, and Zyra was still very much in command. The coming battles would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But he also knew this: humans were unpredictable. Humans were creative, and humans were not easily broken. If he could survive tonight, maybe he could find a way to turn this fight. Maybe he could show Zyra and her entire army that humanity was not to be underestimated. High above, the stars began to pierce the smoke-filled sky. The colony's lights were dim, flickering, but the humans had not yet fallen. And somewhere among them, one man stood alone, unbowed, preparing for the impossible challenge ahead. Zyra's shadow loomed across the streets as she descended slightly from her hovering platform, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "Impressive," she murmured, almost to herself. But impressive does not survive forever. Ethan did not flinch. He adjusted his rifle, checked the traps he had set, and whispered softly under his breath, "We'll see about that." The night was far from over, but the first battle had been won, not by numbers, not by strength, but by human ingenuity, courage, and determination. And Ethan knew that tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The night lingered over the ruined colony, but Ethan did not rest. He moved carefully through the streets, avoiding debris that could give away his position. Fires flickered in the distance, casting shadows that danced like spirits across broken walls. The alien army had regrouped, more cautious now, but their presence was heavier than before. Zyra had not returned to her ship. She remained on the battlefield, observing, planning, waiting. Ethan understood one truth clearly: this was no ordinary enemy. Each step he took, each trap he set, was measured against an intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Zyra did not act on instinct alone. She analyzed, she learned, she adapted. Every human movement was catalogued and studied, and yet she had been surprised. That surprise had given Ethan a small but crucial advantage. He moved from building to building, checking his makeshift defenses. Explosives were set, tripwires stretched, and fire lines rigged to funnel approaching aliens into narrow corridors. The colony, despite the devastation, was his battlefield now, and every corner, every shadow was a weapon. A faint vibration in the air warned him of movement. His ears, trained over years of survival and combat, picked up the slight hum of alien soldiers gliding over rubble. He crouched behind a collapsed wall, rifle ready, eyes scanning for the first sign of the advancing troops. When they appeared, a small group of 4, he did not hesitate. The first blast struck the nearest soldier's chest, throwing sparks into the air. The others reacted instantly, scanning the streets with their glowing eyes. But Ethan was already moving, ducking into a ruined alleyway and pulling a lever he had connected to a dangling mass of rubble above the entrance. It fell, pinning 2 more soldiers and blocking their advance. The remaining one fired, but the shot bounced harmlessly off his makeshift shield. Ethan returned fire, and the soldier crumpled silently to the ground. He paused for a moment, catching his breath. One wave had been eliminated, but he knew this was only the beginning. Zyra watched from a higher vantage point, floating above the plaza with an unsettling calm. Her glowing eyes followed every move, and though she had not yet intervened directly, her presence was enough to chill anyone who saw her. "Clever human," she murmured, "but clever will not win the war." Ethan did not hear her, but he felt it, the weight of her gaze like a physical pressure. He ignored it, focusing instead on the streets ahead. Every step was deliberate, every decision calculated. He could not allow himself to panic, even as the alien army began to adjust. They were learning from his tactics, adapting to his traps, and beginning to move in patterns that suggested more coordinated attacks. He needed a plan, and quickly. The first skirmishes had bought time, but they could not hold the aliens forever. He crouched in the shadows of a half-collapsed building, thinking. The colony's energy grid was still partially functional. If he could reroute power, he could create a temporary energy field, enough to slow them, perhaps even trap some. It was risky, but he had no choice. Ethan moved through the ruined tunnels beneath the city, avoiding patrols and scanning every corridor. The hum of alien sensors filled the air, a constant reminder that he was being hunted. He reached the main power hub, a shattered building that had once supplied energy to the entire colony. Using the remnants of cables and terminals, he began rerouting power to create an unstable energy pulse. It was dangerous. A miscalculation could fry the circuits and leave him completely exposed. Hours passed as he worked, hands steady despite the tension, mind racing with calculations. Finally, he connected the last cable. A faint hum filled the hub, and then a surge of energy rippled through the tunnels. Lights flickered in the streets above, and the alien soldiers entering the city suddenly hesitated. Their sensors were overwhelmed, signals scrambled by the pulse. Ethan seized the moment. He fired rapidly, hitting soldiers before they could recover. Explosions echoed as some tripped into his traps, others ran blindly into collapsing debris. The pulse had given him the advantage he needed, and for a moment it seemed the colony could breathe. But Zyra was not so easily fooled. She descended quickly, landing with a controlled grace that shook the ground beneath her. "You use tricks," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "but tricks will not save you from the inevitable." Ethan did not respond. Words were useless here. Every second counted, and every second he delayed could mean survival for more humans. He moved through the streets, drawing the aliens toward his next trap. Fires roared around him, lighting the battlefield in a chaotic glow. The humans who had been hiding began to watch, some daring to cheer softly from their shelters. They were learning hope from one man's defiance. Zyra followed, analyzing every movement. She noted his speed, his precision, his use of terrain. For the first time, she felt a challenge that intrigued her. This human was not like the others. He was not panicked, not weak, not predictable. He was something else entirely, resilient, intelligent, fearless. Ethan paused near a narrow alley, noticing a group of alien soldiers advancing in formation. He grinned faintly, already seeing the solution. He triggered a series of charges he had set earlier, collapsing the walls of adjacent buildings to funnel them into the alley. The soldiers found themselves trapped, unable to move forward or retreat. Ethan fired from a high vantage point, taking out 2 before the others could react. Then, with careful timing, he pulled a final trigger, sealing the alley with heavy debris. The humans watching began to cheer, louder this time. Their fear was giving way to courage. Even in the midst of destruction, the spark of resistance had been lit. Ethan did not allow himself to feel pride. Pride could be dangerous. He needed focus. The alien army was vast, and Zyra remained at the edge of the battlefield, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hours turned into a relentless cycle of attacks, traps, and strategic movements. Ethan moved tirelessly, his body pushed to its limits, but his mind remained sharp. Each encounter taught him something new about the aliens, their patterns, their weaknesses, their reliance on technology over intuition. He noted the slightest hesitation, the smallest flaw in their coordination, and used it to his advantage. Zyra's patience began to wane. She had anticipated surrender, chaos, and despair, but not skillful resistance. Every human who had tried to fight her army before had failed quickly, but this one had survived, adapted, and outsmarted her soldiers repeatedly. She could not deny it. His ingenuity was extraordinary. Ethan moved to the plaza where the largest group of soldiers had gathered. Using the debris, he created a false path, leading them into a trap lined with explosives and energy pulses. As the aliens followed, he fired from the shadows, taking out soldiers methodically. One by one, they fell or were trapped, their movements hindered by his clever planning. Zyra descended further, closer to the human. She could not allow him to continue. With a flick of her hand, a powerful pulse surged through the area, scattering debris and knocking Ethan to the ground. He rolled quickly, avoiding the worst of the shockwave, but his body ached. He could feel the weight of the battle pressing down, but he forced himself to move, ignoring pain and fatigue. She stood before him now, taller than any building nearby, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "Your tricks are impressive," she said, "but they cannot stop me." Ethan met her gaze, unwavering. "I don't need to stop you," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I just need to survive and make sure my people survive." Zyra studied him, noting the resolve in his eyes. He was not afraid. He did not flee. He did not beg. He stood alone, facing an entire army without flinching. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, respect, tinged with disbelief. The pulse of the city quieted slightly as the alien soldiers regrouped. The humans who had been hiding watched in awe, whispering among themselves. One human had done what they all thought impossible, survived against the Empress's army. One human had shown them that courage and intelligence could rival strength and technology. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The alien army would not give up. Zyra would not give up. But he also knew that human ingenuity was a weapon the aliens could never fully anticipate. Each small victory bought time, and time was precious. He could see it in the eyes of the humans who dared to peek from their shelters. Hope was returning. As dawn approached, Ethan moved to a higher vantage point, surveying the battlefield. Fires burned in pockets, smoke hung in the air, and the alien army had not yet advanced in full force. They were wary now, cautious, adapting to his unpredictability. It was a temporary reprieve, but it was enough. Zyra hovered in the distance, her gaze unwavering. She had not yet intervened directly in full, but she had seen enough to know that this human was extraordinary. Her mind, vast and calculating, began to consider strategies she had never needed before. One human, standing alone, had managed to outthink her soldiers repeatedly. Ethan adjusted his rifle and whispered softly, "We'll see who survives this." The city was quiet for a moment, but the tension remained. The battle was far from over. The alien army was patient, relentless, and powerful. Yet one human had survived the first night, not by brute force, but by ingenuity, courage, and the refusal to surrender. High above, the first light of dawn pierced the smoke-filled sky. The colony was battered, but not defeated. The humans had seen what one man could do, and the spark of hope burned brighter than any fire on the streets below. Ethan stood alone, but he was ready. The next wave would come, and when it did, he would be waiting. And somewhere, Zyra realized that a single human might be more dangerous than her entire army. The first light of morning revealed the true scale of the devastation. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were cracked and burning, and the silence between skirmishes was deafening. The alien army had not advanced fully, but their presence loomed over every corner of the colony. Ethan moved carefully, his senses sharp, every shadow a potential threat. His body ached from the night's fights, but his mind was alive with calculation. Every step he had taken had been deliberate, and now he needed a plan to do more than survive. He needed to turn the battle in humanity's favor. The humans who had hidden through the night began to emerge cautiously. Small groups moved along the edges of the rubble, carrying supplies, helping the wounded and scavenging equipment. They watched Ethan from a distance, their eyes full of hope and admiration. They had never believed one man could resist the Empress's army alone, but he had proven them wrong. One person had survived, and survived with strategy and intelligence that no alien had anticipated. Ethan knew he could not fight alone forever. The alien army would adapt, and Zyra was no longer observing passively. Her glowing eyes scanned the streets constantly, and she began to place her elite soldiers in positions to test his responses. She wanted to see if this human could survive a direct confrontation. Ethan moved through the streets, taking stock of his resources. He had traps, improvised weapons, and the scattered humans ready to help in small ways. He knew that if he could force the aliens into the ruined cityscape, he could control their movements. Narrow alleys, collapsed buildings, and debris were advantages he could exploit. Humans thrived in improvisation, and in this battlefield, improvisation was more powerful than brute strength. He paused atop a crumbling wall, scanning the horizon. A squad of alien soldiers glided forward, moving more cautiously than before. Their formation was tight, their movements precise, but they were still predictable in a way that humans could exploit. Ethan smiled faintly. The patterns were there, like a puzzle waiting for the right solution. He moved quickly, setting small but effective traps along their route. Wires stretched to trip them, small charges placed strategically, and makeshift barricades that could funnel them into areas where he could strike first. Each preparation was like setting pieces on a chessboard. Every alien that fell into his traps was a small victory, a delay that allowed more humans to survive and prepare. The first clash came swiftly. Ethan fired from a high vantage point as the squad entered the alley. The trap collapsed partially, pinning two of the soldiers. Sparks flew as energy pulses hit their armor, disrupting their coordination. The remaining soldiers attempted to regroup, but the narrow alley prevented them from using their numbers effectively. Ethan fired carefully, taking down one after another with precision. High above, Zyra's presence felt heavier. She had begun to descend, moving with the grace and authority of someone who had never needed to fight directly before. Her glowing eyes scanned every move, tracking Ethan's tactics, noting the patterns, and calculating the risks. She did not yet intervene fully, but the soldiers under her command moved with renewed caution. She had underestimated the human, and her interest was now personal. Ethan paused as the last of the squad fell. He knew their deaths were only temporary setbacks for Zyra's forces. She had countless soldiers, and she would adapt. He needed to escalate his tactics, not merely rely on traps. The humans in hiding watched him move with quiet admiration, whispering words of encouragement and awe. One of them, a young engineer named Leela, approached cautiously with a small supply of improvised explosives. "You'll need more firepower," she said softly. "I can help." Ethan nodded. He had been waiting for this moment, the first real reinforcement from the surviving humans. Together, they could do more than survive, they could fight back. He quickly instructed her to help prepare larger traps in critical areas, places where the alien army could be funneled into confined spaces. Zyra moved closer, sensing the growing coordination among humans. She descended into the streets, moving faster than any human could follow. Her presence alone caused smaller squads of soldiers to hesitate. She spoke in the universal language of the colonies, though her words were alien and deliberate. "You will not survive this. Your efforts are futile." Ethan did not answer verbally. Words were not necessary. He had learned that action spoke louder than speech, and in this case, action meant survival and protection for the humans he had inspired. The second wave approached, larger and more coordinated. Ethan and Leela set off the first of the traps, collapsing a building partially to funnel the aliens into a narrow corridor. The humans who had gathered provided distractions, throwing projectiles, igniting fires, and creating confusion among the advancing soldiers. Ethan's rifle fired in precise intervals, taking down soldiers as they struggled to adjust to the unpredictable terrain. Zyra observed from a slight distance, noting his tactics. She had never seen a species use the environment so effectively against her soldiers. Humans were fragile, unpredictable, and yet cunning beyond expectation. For the first time, she felt respect mingled with frustration. She had underestimated them, and now one human had proven she could not simply overpower every resistance with her army's strength. Ethan paused atop a ruined platform, analyzing the battlefield. The humans' morale was rising. Every alien that fell gave them courage. He realized that this was no longer just about survival, it was about turning the tide of perception. Humans could not defeat the alien army completely, not yet, but they could survive long enough to fight smarter. The third clash came without warning. Zyra finally moved fully into the battle, sending her elite soldiers directly after Ethan. They were faster, stronger, and better coordinated than anything he had faced so far. He ducked into a narrow alley, leading them through a gauntlet of traps he had prepared. Explosions erupted, beams of energy flickered, and debris fell as the aliens struggled to navigate the terrain. Ethan fired from above, taking precise shots while the humans he had inspired moved strategically to create more obstacles. Zyra observed closely. She had expected fear, not ingenuity, chaos, not strategy. Ethan's actions were methodical, calculated, and fearless. Every step he took taught her something new about human determination. She had faced countless species across the stars, yet none had survived against her in such a manner. This one human stood alone, and his survival forced her to consider tactics she had never needed before. Hours passed as the battle raged. Ethan moved tirelessly, using every resource available. Collapsed buildings, energy conduits, debris, and the humans who had rallied around him. Each encounter taught him more about the aliens' weaknesses, their reliance on patterns, their inability to adapt quickly to unpredictability, and their overconfidence in technological superiority. By midday, Ethan had created a series of traps and diversions that slowed the alien advance significantly. Zyra's soldiers were cautious, moving in smaller, more hesitant groups. The humans, emboldened by Ethan's defiance, began to take more initiative, using improvised weapons and clever strategies to disrupt the invaders. Ethan paused to catch his breath. His body was exhausted, but his mind remained sharp. He looked out over the plaza where the Empress now hovered, her glowing eyes tracking every move. She had finally recognized the threat he posed, not just as a human survivor, but as a symbol of resistance. Zyra descended further, moving closer to Ethan. Her presence was oppressive, yet he did not flinch. She spoke again, her voice carrying a weight that shook the air. "Your tactics amuse me, human, but amusement does not grant victory." Ethan did not reply verbally. He adjusted his rifle and observed her movements carefully. He had noticed patterns even in her direct interventions, small delays, predictable sequences, and overconfidence. Every advantage he could exploit mattered, and he was ready to use them. The humans who had gathered around the edges of the battlefield continued to watch, whispering words of courage to one another. Ethan's actions had inspired them. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope burned within them. They had seen one human stand alone against an alien army and survive. If he could do it, perhaps they could too. Zyra finally landed fully in the plaza, her form towering over the ruined structures. She moved with an elegance that belied the threat she represented. Ethan watched her carefully, knowing that a direct confrontation would be inevitable. But he also knew that humans had something her army could never fully predict: ingenuity, adaptability, and relentless courage. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew that the battle was far from over. Zyra's army would not give up, and she would not be easily defeated. But the tide had begun to shift. One human, using strategy and intelligence, had forced hesitation into an entire alien army. The humans who had survived the night were no longer merely hiding. They were learning, observing, and preparing to fight. As afternoon approached, Ethan moved to a high vantage point to observe the battlefield. His traps had slowed the aliens, his tactics had inspired the humans, and his courage had challenged the Empress herself. The first wave of the day had passed, but he knew the next would be larger, stronger, and more dangerous. He adjusted his rifle, checked his equipment, and prepared for the battles to come. High above, Zyra's gaze followed him relentlessly. She had never faced a species that could resist her so effectively. One human had turned the impossible into a temporary victory. She did not yet understand how this was possible, but she would adapt. She would challenge him directly, and she would see if his ingenuity could withstand the full might of her power. Ethan did not fear her. He had survived the night, outsmarted waves of soldiers, and inspired his people. He understood the stakes, and he understood the enemy. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the alien army had been forced to respect the humans' unpredictability. And somewhere in the smoke-filled streets, one man stood alone, ready to face whatever came next. The fight was not just about survival anymore. It was about proving that humans, with their courage and ingenuity, could challenge even the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The sun hung high over the colony, casting a harsh light on the broken streets and shattered buildings. Smoke curled from fires that had burned through the night, carrying the acrid scent of destruction. The alien army had regrouped, larger and more organized than before. Their soldiers moved with caution now, wary of the traps and tactics that had defeated so many of their squads already. But the humans had no time to rest. The fight was far from over. Ethan crouched behind the remains of a collapsed tower, surveying the battlefield. His rifle rested lightly in his hands, though his fingers were tense, ready to act at a moment's notice. The humans who had survived the first waves had begun to take initiative, scouting small areas, retrieving supplies, and fortifying their positions. Some of them had even begun to set minor traps on their own, inspired by Ethan's ingenuity. Yet he knew that morale alone could not win the day. Zyra was approaching, this time in full force, her presence undeniable. The Empress moved with calculated grace, her glowing eyes scanning every detail of the ruined city. She had finally understood the extent of Ethan's skill and determination. His survival was no longer a curiosity. It was a challenge she could not ignore. Ethan moved quickly, ducking through alleys and rubble, setting traps designed to funnel the approaching soldiers into confined spaces. He had learned from the previous waves that narrow streets were advantageous. Alien soldiers relied on speed, numbers, and coordination. In tight corridors, their strengths were muted. The humans could use unpredictability to their advantage. A squad appeared first, gliding silently over the debris. Ethan triggered one of his traps, causing a metal beam to fall, blocking their advance. Sparks flew as the beam struck the nearest soldier, and the rest hesitated, caught in a carefully designed crossfire zone. Ethan fired, taking down one soldier after another, each shot precise, each movement deliberate. From above, Zyra watched, noting every action, every pattern. "Clever human," she murmured, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "But clever does not defeat the inevitable." Ethan did not answer. Words were useless now. He had learned that only action counted. Every second was precious, every move a potential lifesaver for the humans who had started to rally around him. The next wave was larger, faster, and more coordinated. Zyra had clearly assigned elite soldiers to test his defenses. Ethan recognized them immediately, taller, faster, more heavily armored, and equipped with advanced energy weapons. They moved in perfect synchronization, each anticipating the other's actions. Ethan ducked behind a wall and waited, analyzing their approach. He had one chance to create a decisive advantage. He triggered a series of explosives he had prepared days ago, collapsing half a building onto the soldiers' path. Dust and smoke filled the air, and the aliens were momentarily trapped. Ethan fired from above, striking two before they could move. The remaining soldiers struggled to escape the rubble, their coordination disrupted by the chaos. Zyra's voice echoed, almost soft, almost amused. "Your efforts amuse me, human, but amusement will not save you." Ethan moved swiftly, leading the soldiers through another narrow alley. There, he had rigged a series of energy pulses connected to the city's damaged power grid. As the soldiers entered, the pulses surged, temporarily immobilizing them and disrupting their armor systems. Sparks flew and alarms blared, and Ethan fired again, taking out two more soldiers. The humans watching from the ruins whispered words of encouragement, their fear replaced by hope. They had seen Ethan survive impossible odds, and now they began to realize that survival was not enough. Resistance was possible. One human had shown them the path. Ethan paused to catch his breath. His body was strained, but his mind was sharper than ever. He knew that Zyra would not remain a passive observer for long. Her intelligence was vast, her patience immense, but he had already learned that even she could be tested. Humans were unpredictable. Their ingenuity could exploit even the smallest miscalculation. Suddenly, Zyra moved. Faster than Ethan had anticipated, she descended into the plaza, sending a shockwave that shook the ground. Debris flew in every direction, knocking over smaller buildings and scattering the humans who had gathered. Ethan rolled to the side, avoiding the worst of the impact, and quickly assessed the situation. This was it, the direct confrontation. Zyra stood before him now, towering, radiant, terrifying. Her armor gleamed in the harsh sunlight, and energy pulses ran across her body like living veins. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, studying, calculating, measuring his every reaction. "You have survived longer than I expected," she said, her voice calm, almost musical in its rhythm. "But survival is not victory. Surrender, human, and your people may yet live." Ethan shook his head slightly, gripping his rifle tighter. "I don't surrender," he said. "Not today." "Not ever." She stepped forward, her presence alone pressing down on the streets like a physical force. Soldiers nearby froze, awaiting her command. Ethan knew that one mistake could be fatal. He moved carefully, using the rubble for cover, drawing her attention without exposing himself completely. The first strike came without warning. Zyra unleashed a pulse of energy from her hand, sending shockwaves through the plaza. Ethan rolled, narrowly avoiding the blast, and fired at the elite soldiers nearby. Sparks flew as his shots hit their armor, causing temporary malfunctions. He could feel the heat of the blast behind him, the sheer force of her presence pushing him to act faster, think sharper, and move smarter. He darted through the streets, leading Zyra and her soldiers into a trap he had prepared weeks ago. Narrow alleys, partially collapsed buildings, and hidden explosives turned the battlefield into a maze designed to neutralize their advantages. Every step he took forced the aliens to adapt, and adaptation took time, even for them. Zyra pursued him relentlessly, moving with a grace that defied human understanding. Each movement was calculated, each attack precise. She aimed to overwhelm him not with numbers but with sheer skill. Ethan fired from above, hitting soldiers strategically to create distractions, forcing her to adjust her focus repeatedly. Hours passed in a blur of movement, traps, explosions, and precise shots. The humans who had been hiding began to engage more actively, throwing improvised weapons, igniting fires, and using debris to slow the alien advance. Ethan's leadership was subtle but powerful. One man had inspired hope, and hope had become a weapon in itself. Zyra paused briefly, hovering above the battlefield. Her glowing eyes followed Ethan, studying his tactics, calculating his limits. She had expected fear, panic, and surrender. What she had found instead was courage, intelligence, and unyielding determination. A single human had survived where countless species had fallen. Ethan paused in a narrow corridor, assessing his next move. He knew that a direct attack from Zyra would be devastating, but he had one final plan, a gambit that relied entirely on human unpredictability. He set a series of traps designed not only to slow the enemy, but to manipulate their movements into a precise pattern. Every explosion, every obstacle, every shot was part of the plan. The first of Zyra's elite soldiers approached the corridor, moving carefully to avoid the traps. Ethan triggered the first charge, collapsing part of a building behind them, cutting off their escape. He fired precisely, taking down the lead soldier. The others hesitated, caught in the perfect funnel he had created. Zyra's presence grew heavier. She descended directly into the corridor, her glowing eyes fixed on him. Ethan did not falter. He had anticipated her movement. Every trap, every diversion, every calculation had been designed for this moment. "You have courage," she said softly, almost as if admiring him. "But courage cannot defeat destiny." Ethan moved quickly, drawing her forward into the final stage of his plan. He activated the last series of energy pulses, collapsing debris to funnel her and her soldiers into a confined space where her power was limited. Sparks flew, alarms blared, and the soldiers' coordination faltered. For the first time, Zyra was forced to act in real time, adjusting to circumstances she had not anticipated. Ethan fired from above, striking precise targets to maintain the chaos. The humans nearby moved cautiously, aiding indirectly by igniting fires and creating additional obstacles. The battlefield had transformed into a dynamic trap, designed to exploit every predictable pattern in the aliens' advance. Zyra finally paused, hovering in the confined space. Her glowing eyes narrowed as she assessed the human before her. Ethan met her gaze without fear. He had survived every wave, outsmarted her soldiers, and manipulated the battlefield itself. The impossible was no longer impossible. For the first time, Zyra felt a flicker of doubt. One human had challenged her at every turn, surviving attacks she had assumed would be fatal. She had underestimated humanity's ingenuity, creativity, and courage. One human, standing alone, had forced hesitation into an entire army. Ethan breathed heavily but remained focused. The battle was far from over, but he had shown something that could not be measured by weapons or numbers. He had shown that humans, with their ingenuity and unyielding spirit, could stand against overwhelming odds. The Empress moved back slightly, her glowing eyes locked on him. She had been tested, challenged, and in some measure surprised. The humans had not fallen. The tide of the battle had shifted, not yet decisively, but perceptibly. One man had changed the battlefield, forcing her to adapt in ways she had never before needed to. Ethan stood in the rubble, rifle ready, traps set, and mind alert. Zyra's shadow loomed over the streets, but he no longer felt the crushing weight of fear. He had survived, adapted, and inspired. The humans around him had seen what one person could achieve, and the spark of hope burned brighter than ever. The next wave would come. Zyra's full power would be unleashed, but Ethan was ready. He understood the enemy, the terrain, and his own limits. And he knew that even against an entire army and the might of the Empress herself, humans had one advantage no alien could fully anticipate: courage, ingenuity, and the refusal to surrender. The sun had climbed high over the ruined colony, casting stark shadows over broken streets and collapsed buildings. Smoke rose from fires that burned uncontrollably, carrying the acrid scent of destruction into the sky. The alien army had fully regrouped now. Their soldiers moved with careful coordination, scanning every corner, anticipating every trap. Yet the humans who had survived the earlier attacks had begun to emerge from hiding. They were not armed like soldiers, but they carried courage and determination, a courage inspired by Ethan. Ethan crouched behind a half-collapsed wall, surveying the battlefield. He had fought alone for days, setting traps, leading enemies into narrow alleys, and using every scrap of the ruined city to his advantage. Now, the final stage of his plan would begin. The humans were ready to aid in small ways, creating diversions, lighting fires, and harassing the alien soldiers. But the final confrontation would not be won by them alone. It would be won by one human, standing against the might of the Empress. Zyra appeared above the plaza, her presence overwhelming. She moved with the grace of someone who had never been challenged before, and yet her glowing eyes betrayed something new: curiosity. She had faced countless species across the galaxy, countless armies that had fallen before her power. Yet this human had survived every wave, outsmarted every soldier, and turned the battlefield into a maze of traps and unpredictability. "You have survived far longer than I expected," she said, her voice calm and commanding. "But this is where it ends. One human cannot resist an empire. One human cannot defeat me." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "I'm not trying to defeat you alone," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'm trying to survive and show my people they don't have to fear you." Zyra's gaze swept the streets. Her soldiers advanced, forming a tight, coordinated wave. She was testing him, measuring the full extent of his ingenuity before committing her own strength. Ethan knew the risk. One misstep could end everything, but he had anticipated this moment. Every movement, every diversion, every trap he had set was leading to this, an opportunity to exploit the alien army's strengths against them. He moved swiftly, leading a squad of soldiers toward a narrow alley he had reinforced with explosives and energy conduits from the city's damaged power grid. As the soldiers entered, Ethan triggered the first charge. A section of the collapsed building fell, blocking their retreat. Sparks flew as the energy conduits overloaded, sending a pulse that temporarily disabled their armor systems. Ethan fired with precise shots, taking down 2 soldiers while the remaining soldiers struggled to regain coordination. Zyra descended, her glowing eyes fixed on him. She unleashed a pulse of energy that sent shockwaves across the plaza, scattering debris and forcing humans to dive for cover. Ethan rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the impact. His heart pounded, but his mind remained sharp. This was not just a battle of strength. It was a battle of wits, of adaptability, of human ingenuity against alien might. He moved quickly through the rubble, luring the elite soldiers toward another trap. Fires roared in nearby streets, ignited by the humans, creating smoke that obscured their movements. Ethan fired from above, hitting precise targets, disrupting their formation. The soldiers faltered, giving the humans room to maneuver. Zyra's voice cut through the chaos. "You cannot outthink me forever, human. I will end this." Ethan's gaze met hers. He knew that words were irrelevant now. Every second counted. He had designed the battlefield itself to create opportunities to force her army into disadvantageous positions. Each trap, each explosion, each diversion was part of a larger plan that had been building for days. The humans rallied. They had learned from Ethan's example, moving with courage and cleverness. Some blocked corridors, some threw improvised weapons, and some used debris to hinder the alien soldiers. Their combined efforts created a chaotic environment that even Zyra's elite soldiers struggled to control. Ethan led her soldiers into the final trap, the culmination of his careful planning. A series of energy conduits and explosives lined the alley, designed to collapse structures strategically while immobilizing enemy soldiers. As the aliens entered, he triggered the charges. Explosions erupted, debris fell, and the energy conduits pulsed violently. The soldiers were trapped, disoriented, and forced into a confined space where their numbers counted for little. Zyra landed directly in the alley, her glowing eyes fixed on him. She moved with terrifying speed, striking with energy pulses and controlled force. Ethan dodged, rolled, and fired, exploiting her brief hesitations. Every movement was precise, every shot calculated. He was not fast enough to overpower her, but he was clever enough to survive. Hours passed in a blur of action. Ethan moved with constant focus, using every advantage the ruined city offered. He dodged, fired, and led the soldiers into traps repeatedly. The humans nearby provided indirect support, creating distractions, igniting fires, and causing chaos. The alien army, despite its numbers and technology, was forced to adapt continuously. Zyra paused briefly, hovering above the battlefield. Her glowing eyes followed him relentlessly. She had expected fear, panic, and surrender, but none of those had appeared. This human had resisted every wave, outsmarted countless soldiers, and forced her to confront his ingenuity directly. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, respect mingled with disbelief. Ethan paused atop a collapsed building, catching his breath but keeping his eyes fixed on her. The humans below whispered among themselves, watching, learning, and hoping. One man had stood alone against an alien army, and now they saw that survival was possible. Resistance was possible, hope was alive. Zyra descended further, her form towering over the streets. "You have courage," she said softly, "but courage alone will not defeat me." Ethan's lips curved into a small smile. "I don't need courage alone," he said. "I have ingenuity, determination, and the unwillingness to surrender, and that's something your army can never predict." The final wave of soldiers advanced, stronger and more coordinated than ever. Ethan moved with purpose, drawing them into a section of the city he had prepared meticulously. Narrow alleys, debris, and energy conduits created a controlled battlefield. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to exploit their strengths against them. He triggered a series of charges, collapsing structures strategically and sending energy pulses through the streets. Sparks flew, alarms blared, and the soldiers were immobilized temporarily. Ethan fired with precision, taking down key targets while avoiding Zyra's attacks. The humans moved cautiously, creating diversions and maintaining chaos. Zyra, finally recognizing the full extent of his planning, focused her energy. She struck with force, but Ethan anticipated her moves. He dodged, rolled, and used the terrain to shield himself. Every pulse she unleashed was countered by his strategy, forcing her to adapt in real time. For the first time, she experienced uncertainty on the battlefield. The humans, inspired by Ethan's defiance, began to take bold actions. They threw debris, ignited fires, and used improvised weapons to disrupt the alien soldiers further. The battlefield had become a maze of unpredictability, chaos, and strategy. One man had transformed an entire colony into a fortress of ingenuity and courage. Ethan moved to the heart of the plaza, confronting Zyra directly. The Empress's glowing eyes fixed on him, analyzing every move. He could feel the pressure of her presence, the sheer power she wielded, but he stood firm. Every step he had taken had led to this moment, the final confrontation. "You are impressive, human," Zyra said. "I underestimated your species, but one cannot defy an empire and survive." "I don't need to survive alone," Ethan said, his voice steady. I fight for everyone who still has hope. I fight because we refuse to surrender. Zyra unleashed a final, massive pulse of energy, sending shockwaves through the plaza. Ethan rolled, dodged, and fired, exploiting every small hesitation in her movements. His traps detonated strategically, collapsing debris onto soldiers, sending them into energy pulses, and creating chaos among the ranks. The humans seized the moment, moving with courage and precision, distracting soldiers and exploiting the confusion. Ethan's careful planning had transformed the battlefield into a maze where even Zyra's soldiers could not operate with full efficiency. Finally, Zyra hovered above him, breathing, or whatever passed for breath in her species. Her glowing eyes narrowed, studying him. She had expected fear, panic, and surrender. She had found none. One human had survived, adapted, and fought in a way that no alien could anticipate fully. Ethan raised his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired at the energy conduits he had rigged. A massive pulse erupted, disabling key systems, immobilizing the remaining soldiers and sending a final shockwave through the plaza. The alien army faltered, their coordination destroyed, their advance halted. Zyra landed, her form towering over him. For the first time, she paused, studying the human who had stood against her entire army. Ethan stood firm, exhausted but unbroken. The humans below cheered softly, witnessing what one man's courage, ingenuity, and determination could achieve. "You have survived," Zyra said softly, almost a whisper. "I cannot believe it." Ethan lowered his rifle slightly, breathing heavily. "Believe it," he said simply. "Humans survive, we adapt, we fight, and we never surrender." Zyra's eyes glowed faintly, and she retreated slowly, signaling her army to withdraw. The alien soldiers followed, cautious and reluctant, leaving the colony battered but free. Ethan remained standing in the plaza, alone but victorious. His people began to emerge fully, their courage restored, their hope rekindled. The sun shone on the ruined streets, illuminating the destruction, but also the spark of humanity that could not be extinguished. One man had stood against an empire and survived. One man had shown that courage, ingenuity, and determination were forces stronger than technology, stronger than numbers, and stronger than fear itself. Ethan looked around at the humans who had survived, their eyes full of admiration and hope. "This isn't the end," he said softly. "It's just the beginning." And somewhere in the skies beyond, Zyra watched, unable to believe what she had witnessed. One human, standing alone, had outsmarted her army and survived. The lessons of this battle would linger in her mind forever. Humanity had shown its strength, not just in numbers or weapons, but in spirit, ingenuity, and unbreakable courage.